Okay, so in this model, we're going to look at psychology and what psychology can tell us about creativity, and in particular, looking at what's known as the creative personality. What is it about personality traits that could contribute to the idea of being creative and having creative thoughts? So, when people first started to investigate this in any sort of scientific way in the early 20th, late 19th century, it was felt that in order to understand creativity, they had to understand creative people. So, creativity was a certain quality, as we've seen through the modern era, of individuals. Certain people possessed these qualities. At least that was the understanding. They were different than most people. They were special, they were unique, they were gifted, they had talents, but they also had a whole set of other qualities that came along with it. And so the early days of research and the beginnings of psychology began to focus on these individuals to see what can we learn about the people, the way they think, the way they behave, the way they act, that could tell us about creativity and how it works. Unfortunately, this was also the heyday of the romantic model of creativity, which grew out of the mid 19th century. And so it was mistakenly believed that creativity somehow had to do with mental illness, that not only were creative people, i.e., geniuses, gifted and unusual, but they were also, slightly neurotic, eccentric, irrational, prone to addiction, mood swings, and all of this was helped with a whole sort of cultural idea of, the drug taking, alcoholic, um, unhappy romantic genius. And so this became popularized, as we've seen, throughout culture, all the way through the 19th century and through the 20th century. And unfortunately, it became the dominant model for the early psychologists to study. And so there was a strong connection between what's known as psychopathology, mental illness, things that go wrong with the individual, and creativity. And that to be creative meant you had to be slightly mentally ill, and that mentally ill people were somehow slightly creative. Well, all of that began to change in the 1950s with the development of something known as humanistic psychology. This was a big sort of paradigm shift in psychology where psychologists like Maslow, Rogers, and May led the movement that said, to understand people, we don't always have to understand what's wrong with them or why they go wrong. Why don't we also understand what makes things work correctly? What is human well-being? And so they began to shift the focus, and that shift of focus also began to look at creativity. And they realized that creativity is more often associated with well-being. That people feel um, really good when they're being creative, and they can't be creative unless they're feeling really good. Now, that's kind of an exaggeration, but the idea being that if you are severely schizophrenic or depressed, you're simply not going to make anything, and that the act of creativity um, can be seen as a way to sort of provide us with peak experiences. One experience has been identified as the state of flow, which we'll talk about in another presentation. But the idea of when we're creative, we're at our best. We're realizing our true sense of who we are and what we can achieve and what we can do. And so creativity began to shift. It began to be seen as something slightly different than irrational addiction, depression, schizophrenia. Now, all of that stuff didn't necessarily go away because there is somewhat of a connection. But what had happened in the 1950s was things had shifted as the research methods got better, and we began to understand, how to measure these things and how to analyze and how to think of these things. And so one of those things was we began to focus on personality traits, not whole personality types, not whole figures, but certain qualities that everybody has, the smallest unit of individual variation. And when researchers began to look at that in creative people, they began to come up with quite a few things. So out of the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, we began to develop this entire list of qualities of creative people. some of which are listed here and seem pretty obvious. The difficulty with this was that the list got very, very long. Um, these are qualities that correlate with creativity, but researchers have struggled, to agree on exactly which ones, and also to sort of, combine them and figure out what are the key elements. And so what has happened over time is that psychological testing and personality testing has become more sophisticated, and they begin to clump these qualities into what are called factors. And so a lot of things might have a similar sense to them, but they can be grouped under a more general topic. So what has emerged out of this is something called the five-factor model, or the Big Five. And it basically says that all human beings can be differentiated on these five basic qualities. And this has really become the gold standard of personality tests, much more so than more popular ones like the Myers-Briggs, which most psychologists don't really pay any attention to anymore. The five-factor model has been the result of a lot of research and a lot of international research. So they're finding it crosses cultures very easily, whereas other tests didn't. And it's just been confirmed again and again and again with lots of research. So it's a way of synthesizing a broad range of traits and turn them into simpler units. So just quickly to go through them. Openness to experience is our ability to be open to new ideas and experiences. So these are seen as being on a spectrum or an axis. So someone who's really high in this end is someone who craves new experiences, travel, new food, new clothes, new music, and someone who's at the other end of the extreme, might be much more conservative, likes what they like, doesn't like to change things, doesn't like to branch out in terms of experiences. So conscientiousness, how goal-directed, persistent, and organized a person is, and the opposite would be literally the opposite of that. Extroversion, the opposite being introversion. Agreeableness, how much do you prioritize other people's needs and interests, and how much, narcissist, for instance, would be at the opposite end of the spectrum here. And then neuroticism is, how sensitive we are to stress and to negative emotional triggers. So these five things were found to be the key element to personality. So what does this have to do with creativity? Well, which one do you think is the most correlated with creativity, meaning creative people score the highest on this particular one? It's probably pretty obvious. It's openness to experience. So creative people clearly are open to new ideas, new ways of doing things. They tend to be imaginative. They tend to have an appreciation for the arts, whether they're scientists or artists or businessmen or businesswomen. They have a real sense of value for feelings, not just ideas, but how things feel. They're very curious and like to try new things. And then their openness to diverse values, unconventional ways of doing things. And so this was a key finding, that of all the different things that could come up, and some things were negatively correlated with creativity, some things were positive, but this stood out from all the others as being a very dominant form, personality quality, trait, most associated with creativity. A leading researcher in this field who is one of the lead researchers in this whole idea of personality and creativity was this gentleman. Now, I often in my class provide extra credit to the student who can pronounce his name. I think we've actually done that. So this is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He pioneered studies in flow, optimal experiences. One of the key things he did, though, with his grad students was that he would interview hundreds of prominent people in all sorts of fields. So he would contact people in that field, like scientists, and say, who's the most creative scientist? Engineers, who in your opinion is the most creative engineer? So he would use the people in the field to identify the top creative people in that field. And then he and his research students would interview them for hours on all sorts of measures to try and find, what are the qualities of these people, and then put them all together and see what of all the qualities they've identified do most of them seem to have? In other words, what rises to the surface? What was interesting was he actually found three things, three major things. They tend to be curious. Creative people tend to be interested in a great many things. They're curious about lots and lots of different things. They have a complex personality, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. And they have a high tolerance for ambiguity. So going through these things one at a time, what do we see? Well, curiosity. One of the things that came out was that creative people tend to have a great many hobbies. They do a lot of things. They're interested in a great many things. Now, this might seem kind of counterintuitive, right? You think of someone who's great in their field, a specialist in their field, a leader, would be so hyper focused and spend all their time doing what they do um, in order to rise to the top of their field. But that turned out not to be the case. Yes, these people were focused. They were determined. They would concentrate, on their music or their writing or their science. But they also would do lots and lots of other things, or they had lots and lots of interests. Um, Isaac Newton, for instance, probably arguably the greatest scientist of the Western world, wrote more books on religion and alchemy than he did on science. Albert Einstein played the violin. So there's lots and lots of cases, but this was just a real interesting finding that they always had time to do other things that followed their interest. And that interest came out of a sense of wonder. They were almost like children. They would ask lots and lots of questions. Often silly questions or stupid questions. So I'll come to this in a minute with the personality. They weren't afraid of appearing naive necessarily. So curiosity was a key element to what drove these people. Here's a quote by the Italian director Federico Fellini. And it's this whole idea of childish enthusiasm or wonder that, what is amazing in life is this whole sense of wonderment and astonishment. So they're very open in that sense. This is very similar to openness to experience in many, many ways. The second thing was a complex personality. Now, this is not a complicated personality, this is a complex personality. So, what this means is they were able to accommodate personality traits that might seem paradoxical. They're opposites. They don't and shouldn't go together. But what happens with the research that Csikszentmihalyi did was these people seem to embody opposites either simultaneously or at different times, but they had no real difficulty with being both. So he devised a list, and these were the top 10 things that came out. So they had lots of energy, but they often were idle and resting. They were very, very smart. Like I just said a second ago, they could also be naive, ask questions that maybe other people might feel, you shouldn't ask because you might seem stupid. So not afraid. They were responsible and disciplined, but they could also be irresponsible and play a lot. So I'm not going to go through all of the list, just maybe a couple more. You can read it. They were masculine and feminine. And so what happens in our society generally is we're forced to choose one or the other. The culture and society tends to prioritize one quality above another, and one is seen as correct for whatever reason or for whatever purpose, and the other one is seen as something to avoid. But creative people tend to be both. So extrovert and introvert. You might ask, well, how can you be both? One way of thinking about it is maybe you're one or the other depending on the situation. So maybe someone at work is more extrovert and at home they're more introvert, or vice versa. I don't know, but these qualities, what's key about understanding this finding is that not that they necessarily just go between two opposite things, but that they seem to have no personal problem with it, whereas maybe somebody who does go back and forth between extrovert and introvert or masculine or feminine might have some big personal issues with it. So this was a key finding. It was very interesting quality of the personalities of these creative people. And then the third thing was tolerance for ambiguity. So I'll let you read this yourself. So the idea of, things not being clear bothers a lot of people. But for some reason, creative people tend to be okay with that. So let's say, for instance, you're starting something, um, a new painting, a new composition for music, starting a new business. You might not know exactly how it's going to turn out. And for creative people, they seem to have no problem with that. Whereas less creative people tend to struggle with that. They want to know quickly, where's it going? What am I doing? What's it about? How's it going to work? What's the company doing? And so they close themselves off to this state of ambiguity and uncertainty. But people who make creative contributions seem to know that things are unpredictable. There's a random quality to many things. How things take shape requires time, requires failure, requires experimentation, prototyping, all of these things. And so ambiguity scored really high on these people identified as creative. So as an example, I'll show you a couple of examples. This is the American artist Janine Antoni. In one of her video pieces, she wanted a tightrope walk across the horizon of the earth. And so she had to teach herself how to tightrope walk. She didn't know how to do it. And in an interview, one of the things that she said, which I thought was very interesting, was that when she learned to get better at it, it wasn't that she got better at balancing, it's that she got better with being out of balance. That it wasn't certainty that worked for her, but uncertainty. What that meant was, if you're a beginner and you're tightrope walking and you start falling to one side, the tendency is to panic and pull to the other side and overcompensate, and all of a sudden you're falling off in the other direction. Whereas Janine Antoni explained it, when she would lean to one side, she would go, whoops, I'm out of balance, and then come back to the middle. So there wasn't that panic, there wasn't that reaction. She was comfortable with things not being perfect or correct. And so I thought that was an interesting way of talking about ambiguity. And then another thing I want to share with you is this piece. This is an art piece I did called Chiaroscuro, and we've talked about this in class. So, here's a sense of, where you're looking at these 10 photos and you don't know which one is in prison for murder and which one has been murdered. Which of these 5 men are locked up and which of these 5 men are no longer with their families. And so that sense of ambiguity became very, very difficult for many people who saw the piece in the show. They needed to know. And so that, for me, that was one of the most interesting things about making this piece. It was an unintended consequence. I just thought people would respond to this idea of not being able to read evil on somebody's face. But I was struck by how many people came to me demanding that I tell them who's who, because it was tearing them to pieces and they needed to know. So just to wrap it up, there are a great many qualities to creative people. By no means is this just is as simple as 3 qualities. It's a complex issue, but the research does seem to indicate that openness to experience is the key personality trait, and that openness to experience also manifests in these 3 qualities identified by Csikszentmihalyi: curiosity, complex personality, and tolerance for ambiguity. In addition to that, like I said, there are many more. 3 that seem to be pretty prominent in a lot of the literature are these also. So we notice if we look at the biographies of creative people, people that have made an impact creatively, they seem to be very persistent. They don't give up easily. They keep trying things. They fail and they go. They fail and they go. They're also very prolific. They make a lot of work. They do a lot of stuff. And a lot of what they do isn't great, isn't wonderful. A lot of papers they write are not published. A lot of compositions they write are not performed. A lot of paintings they paint are never exhibited. So the idea is to get to that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that are going to really make a breakthrough in your field. You have to do hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. And then finally, risk-taking. They'll take those risks. They'll put themselves out there. They're not afraid of feeling uncomfortable. scared or nervous. Doesn't mean that they're not uncomfortable, scared, or nervous, but they tend to be a little courageous about that. And so, you know, taking risks, hopefully not crazy risks, is a quality that we see also rising to the surface in terms of these biographies. So that's kind of a summary. It's a much more complicated story than that. But those are some of the key findings about the personality and how the mythology of irrationality and the romantic genius just doesn't really seem to fit the science behind it. When they say, for instance, mental illness has a higher incidence in creative people, whether that's schizophrenia or bipolar or hallucinate, whatever it is, the evidence just doesn't bear it out. In fact, the incidence of mental illness in creative people is exactly the same as it is in the general population. It's just nobody's really interested in the guy or the gal next door, but they are interested in that person if they're famous. So we just have kind of a problem with the lens. We're focusing on creative people, and so when they exhibit qualities that are very different or irrational or strange, we make the mistaken assumption of associating that with their creativity. All right. Thank you.